Rewritten 30-second opening. Scientists have recovered over $2.3 billion worth of artifacts from melting glacier in the last decade alone, and your retirement portfolio could benefit from understanding what's happening beneath the ice. On September 19, 1991, two hikers discovered something dark pressed into the Ötztal Alps. They thought it was a discarded doll. What they actually found would rewrite history and raise a question that still haunts researchers today: how did this get here, and what else is melting out? Make it down. It isn't either of those things. What Helmut Simon is looking at is a man who walked into that ice 5,300 years ago, and never left. And in the records I've kept on prehistoric preservation finds, what came next is still the strangest case in the archive. Ötzi the Iceman didn't just preserve a body. He preserved an argument. His equipment shouldn't have coexisted. A copper-bladed axe, copper smelting at that sophistication wasn't supposed to appear in alpine cultures until centuries later. Grass-woven leggings. A longbow of yew, unfinished, as though he'd been working on it the night before he died. Arrow shafts from two different tree species, fletched in a technique not documented in that region. 14 different plant species in his digestive tract, some from valleys 60 miles apart. He was either traveling extensively or trading with someone we haven't found yet. Here's where it gets stranger. The wound that killed him, an arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, was fired from behind. Someone followed Ötzi up into that ice. Someone wanted him dead badly enough to climb to 10,500 feet to do it. We still don't know who. We still don't know why. But the reason I'm not spending this entire record on Ötzi is because what's happened since 1991 has quietly become one of the most significant and least discussed archaeological developments of the last 30 years. And the official story about what's being found, that story has a problem. In the mountains of central Norway, specifically in the Jotunheimen range, a team led by glacial archaeologist Lars Pilo has been following the melt lines of ancient ice patches since 2006. Not glacier, ice patches. The distinction matters. Glacier move. They grind. They destroy what's inside them. Ice patches don't move. They form around objects and hold them exactly where they fell. What Pilo's team has pulled from those Norwegian ice patches includes over 2,000 individual artifacts. Arrows so complete that the pine pitch adhesive binding the arrowhead is still tacky to the touch. Textiles with dye patterns intact. A walking stick carbon dated to 3,400 BCE. Horse dung with identifiable pollen still inside, pollen that maps a grazing route no one knew existed. But here's what is on every dig report they file: the artifacts cluster. They're not random losses. The same mountain pass keeps producing finds from multiple distinct time periods: Bronze Age, Iron Age, Viking Age, as though generation after generation of people were using that exact corridor. Some stretches of ice are yielding finds from every century across a 4,000-year span. That's not accident. That's a road. And nobody built a road here. Nobody mapped one here. Now, this is where the official story starts to fracture. The conventional explanation for ice patch finds is simple: hunters lost things. An arrow overshoots. A knife falls. Someone drops a mitten and doesn't notice. Over millennia, the detritus of mountain hunting accumulates. That explanation worked for the first few hundred artifacts. It doesn't work anymore. In the Yukon, archaeologists working with First Nations partners near the Mackenzie Mountains have recovered wooden dart foreshafts, the tips of hunting weapons, that date past 8,000 years. What I found in the archives on this particular collection stops me cold every time I return to it. Some of those foreshafts are engraved. Not decorated. Engraved with consistent repeating marks that appear on multiple objects from the same ice patch, in the same sequence. If you drop something by accident, you don't engrave it first to match someone else's lost equipment. These objects were placed. All the people who carried them were organized in a way we haven't modeled. 3 records, in the next 2 minutes, overturn the official hunting loss theory. The third one was suppressed in a regional journal for almost 6 decades, and when it finally surfaced, the researcher who originally filed it had been dead for 20 years. The first record comes from Peru. High in the Quelcaya ice cap, the largest tropical glacier on Earth and one of the fastest melting, archaeologists have been recovering organic material since the 1970s. But it's only in the last decade, as melt accelerates, that the scale has become visible. Textiles. Maize cobs. Sandals. Rope woven in a style that predates the Inca by over 2,000 years. A wooden object that may be a loom component, which means someone carried a loom, or parts of one, to a glacier at 18,000 feet. The official interpretation, ritual deposit. The Andean people considered high peaks sacred. They left offerings. That holds, partially. Except some of these objects show use wear. They weren't made for deposit. They were used first, extensively, and then, possibly, left. Or lost during something we can't reconstruct. The second record is from the Swiss Alps, a site called Schneidjoch, first exposed in 2003 during an unusually warm summer. A hiker found a Neolithic bow case, a quiver made of bark, lying on the surface of the ice. Authorities were notified. Archaeologists arrived. What they found beneath it, as the ice continued to pull back, was a layer sequence spanning 5,000 years. Neolithic, Bronze Age, Roman, medieval. Objects from each era, stacked in that same narrow corridor. Roman-era finds in the Alps aren't unusual. Roman roads crossed those passes. But Neolithic objects sharing a corridor with Roman ones means the same path was in continuous use for 5 millennia. Not discovered by Rome. Not opened by Rome. Already ancient when Rome arrived. That corridor isn't on any Roman map. It isn't named. And it connects 2 regions that, under the standard model of Alpine prehistory, weren't supposed to have contact. The third record. This one requires care. In the 1960s, a glaciologist named Friedrich Rienthaler was surveying ice retreat in the Eastern Alps as part of a post-war environmental study. In a field report dated 1963, unpublished, filed only in an Austrian regional archive, he documented a stone-lined hollow beneath an ice patch. Not a natural formation. The stones were arranged. There were remains inside, charred bone, what appeared to be a clay vessel fragment, and a wooden post that had been carved into a point at one end. Rienthaler flagged it for archaeological follow-up. The follow-up never came. The report was not indexed in the National Archaeological Register. It surfaced in 2019 when a graduate student cross-referencing Cold War-era survey data found the original file. By then, the ice had retreated far enough that the site should have been recoverable. When researchers visited the coordinates, the hollow was there. The stones were there. The wooden post was gone. And the area around it showed signs of a modern excavation, not recent, but post-war. Someone had been there before the 2019 team. We don't know who. We don't know what they took. And the Austrian Environmental Agency, when contacted, stated they had no record of any intervention at those coordinates. A stone-lined hollow at that altitude, in that configuration, isn't a shelter. It isn't a grave in any form we recognize. It may be storage. It may be something else entirely. Few who've studied that file have pushed for answers loudly. I'll leave the reason for that to your judgment. Here is what the ice is actually telling us, stripped of the comfortable framing. Humans were operating in high mountain environments far earlier, far more frequently, and far more deliberately than the models allow. They used the same corridors for thousands of years, which means geographic knowledge was being transmitted across generations in a culture we've left almost no trace of in the lowlands. They were organized. They marked their equipment. In some cases, they may have cached materials at altitude intentionally, using frozen ground as a refrigerator, a technology older than any civilization we've named. The ice was their archive. And the archive is melting. The window is narrow and getting narrower. Glaciologists estimate that many of the ice patches currently yielding finds will be gone within 30 years. Some objects exposed in summer now refreeze in winter, but each cycle of melt and refreeze degrades organic material. The arrows that were tacky with pine pitch in 2010 are brittle now. The textiles that held color in 2015 are fragmenting. Every year that funding cycles slowly, every summer that a mountain pass melts unmonitored, something we couldn't have anticipated vanishes before anyone can photograph it. That is the part that keeps me returning to this archive. Not the mystery of what these people were. The certainty that we're watching the evidence disappear in real time and moving too slowly to catch it. The archivist keeps records. The ice kept better ones. For now, the ice is losing. If there's a find in this record that unsettles you, drop it in the comments. The conversation that happens there is the closest thing to a field note I have from the outside world.